the fascinating thing, if you step back from this manifesto, is it is weirdly Trussian. A lot has been gambled on growth and supply-side reforms, which, of course, is what Liz Truss was planning to do. Now, her difficulty was that she put the tax cuts ahead of the growth plan and she didn't get any of it assessed, which is why it went so wrong. And Starmer is not making that mistake.
The Labour manifesto is out today, and though it's 125 pages long with over 30 pictures of Keir Starmer, nowhere does it tell you what major taxes Labour is planning to increase when it assumes power, or how faster economic growth, supposedly the overriding priority, will be suddenly magically conjured up. Labour has explicitly told us what taxes it will not increase: income tax, VAT, national insurance. Fair enough. Together they account for 60% of total tax revenues. Now that, of course, still leaves 40% still up for grabs. And since the UK's tax base is now around £1 trillion a year, that's right, £1 trillion, you're talking 400 billion of taxes left in play. Lovely jubbly. Now, when pressed on what it might do with those taxes, it doesn't rule out increasing. Labour's mantra is that it has no plans to increase the taxes of working people. But what it means by working people is never defined, and when politicians say they have no plans, it usually means they do, but they're just not telling us. Remember Michael Heseltine, who said repeatedly he had no plans to run against Margaret Thatcher. But plans change, don't you know? One thing is pretty clear: if Labour is to avoid the spending cuts already baked in to the official fiscal forecasts it will inherit, and to afford things Labour governments want to do, it will have to increase taxes by a lot and by ways it's not telling us. Perhaps it will raise capital gains tax, as the Lib Dems are proposing, raising billions. That would fall largely on the better off, those with assets that they sell, but many on middling incomes and a bit above would be caught. Do they fit Labour's definition of working people? Or it could curb the tax benefit you get when paying into your pension. That would raise billions more, again, largely from the better off. But it would hit those in the 40% income tax bracket, and there are now millions of them, rising all the time, including millions in the public sector. Are they not working people? Then there's revaluing the council tax bands, absurdly stuck in 1991 levels because politicians lacked the guts to increase them, even as property prices soared. Labour could dress this up with new hefty bans for millionaire properties, which are undertaxed by international standards. But any revaluation would mean more council tax for everybody, including working people. None of this is addressed in Labour's manifesto. Then there's economic growth, the magic elixir designed to cure all your tax and spend worries because it generates more revenues without more taxes. Labour isn't proposing to boost the economy with an injection of Keynesian pump priming, more spending and or tax cuts to jumpstart the economy back into life as Joe Biden did in the States. No. What it proposes, from new planning laws to encourage more house building to fast-tracking green and digital economy investments, these are what are called supply-side reforms, which take time to lead to higher growth. But Labour will need new growth now because it needs new money now. Not easy when the economy didn't grow at all in April. Our biggest market, the Eurozone, is stagnating, and our second biggest market, the United States, is slowing down fast. All developments which will inhibit Labour's ability to break out of the economic doldrums, and all weighty matters on which the Labour manifesto is silent. This is Andrew Neil on Times Radio, your election station. Now, Keir Starmer was asked about taxes in last night's Sky News interview.
No tax rises needed in the plans in our manifesto.
In the plans?
No tax rises for working people. That's income tax, national insurance,
so you're
and VAT.
not ruling out. I just decode that for you guys, because when a politician says no plans, it does mean I might.
Well, Beth,
I've done this a bit. It does.
And he was also asked about revaluing council tax bands.
Well, council tax is too high for many people. It's been going up. It went up again this year, but that's because the government lost control of the economy.
You're not going to do a review of the council tax bands?
I'm really
You know, they were last revalued when I was a teenager, and I'm really old now.
Well, there we go. That's what he said last night on the Sky News event. I'm joined now by Oliver Wright, policy editor of The Times, to go through some of these tax issues. Welcome to the programme. Do you share, which I think is the consensus of commentators outside the Labour Party, anyway, that whatever they're saying in the manifesto, given the fiscal straitjacket they will inherit, very tight, and given that Labour governments like to spend money, want to do things, will be under pressure to spend more money, that some big taxes are going to rise?
Yeah, I mean, I think those people with long memories will remember 1997 and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's election campaign, where they ran a very similar strategy of being cautious, of, emphasising that they weren't going to put up taxes. And then, of course, in Gordon Brown's first budget, you had a fairly unexpected pension raid, which wasn't in the manifesto. And I think a lot of people are rightly pretty sceptical that given the overall economic situation, if Sir Keir Starmer does not want to return to austerity, that he isn't going to have to raise taxes in some form or another.
So which ones will he and Rachel Reeves, his likely Chancellor, go for? I mentioned in my monologue the possibility of capital gains tax, of reducing the amount of tax benefit you get when you pay a pension contribution, and perhaps even the council tax bans. But there are others as well. But these would raise big money.
I mean,
which one do you think they'll?
I mean,
or which
it's
ones
a silly,
will
it's
they
a
go
silly
for?
answer, but it depends how much money they need.
Let's
If you
assume
need
a
a
lot.
lot, you do have to go for something like capital gains or changing the way in which you pay tax on your tax relief on pension contributions. Pension contributions is a big one, and you could dress that up as helping those people who were less well off, because at the moment, obviously, if you don't earn 40%, if you're not up to the 40% threshold, you only get 20% tax relief. So if you evened it out but took a bit of money off, then that would be a good way of raising revenue while saying, I'm helping working people.
I mean, you could argue that, as I understand it, the cost of pension tax relief, of getting tax relief for paying money into your pension, is over 30 billion. It's a lot of money.
Huge amount
and
of
it
money.
is skewed to the better paid as well, because they get to deduct it 40% and 45%. So I guess a Labour government could say, hey, if everybody deducts at 20% of the basic rate, that's quite fair, and we save maybe 10, 12 billion.
Yeah. And the play will be here. They get into power. Oh my goodness, things are so much worse than we thought.
We've seen the books.
Yeah, we've seen the books. It will be.
Terrible.
It will be an utter.
It's a disaster.
It'll be a replay of 2010, perhaps without the note.
What about capital gains tax and this? Because they need money now. By now, I mean when they're in power. When Nigel Lawson raised capital gains tax, there was a 2-week window between announcing it and saying he was going to do it, during which lots of people crystallized their gains at the lower rate of tax. And for the next 2 years, even though he'd increased the rate, capital gains receipts actually fell.
Yeah.
That doesn't help Rachel Reeves balance.
No, that would have to be an announcement that isn't briefed in advance if a politician is capable of doing that.
Sensible people will be making their dispositions now, though, will they not?
I think people are still unclear. I mean, I think a lot of people are taking what Starmer says at face value. And I think, just to play devil's advocate on their side for a moment, I think there is a desire within Labour to come in and impose some constraints on the public sector. I think, the first thing they've got to do is have a comprehensive spending review. And I think that will only be a 1-year comprehensive spending review. And I think that will be pretty tight, probably in line with the government's sort of existing plans. I think where you could see the really big changes is in a year or so's time after that period, when they have a better idea of where the economy is going in terms of growth, and where the pressure from their own backbenchers, who will probably be quite a large number of them, will be to actually start turning on the spending tap. So I think at that point is when you're really looking at those potential revenue raises. I don't think that Rachel Reeves, when she does her first budget in September, October, I don't think there'll be any huge surprises there. It'll be more about putting some of the measures in the manifesto into practice.
What about this business of council tax bans? Now, when they were done under John Major, younger listeners start here, in 1991, the average property, residential property in the UK, was just under £58,000. It's now £292,000, and obviously a lot more in London and the southeast. And yet that is still the basis of the council tax bans. I mean, there must be some temptation to revalue them, to bring them more into line with today's property values. But if you do that, you actually hit a lot of what Labour calls working people.
Yeah, if they have any sense, they will leave council tax revaluation well alone. Now, I mean, you're right, it probably should be done. It's unfair. But, go back even further, to the poll tax. There was some fairly smart things about the poll tax. It was designed to change the way of the system. But the difficulty with all those things is you create winners and you create losers. The winners keep very quiet. The losers scream from the rooftops.
Well, we got the poll tax because the Tory government was too frightened to revalue rates at the time. And indeed, it was forced to do so in Scotland because that was the law. You had to revalue. And they said, oh, we can't do that. Let's try the poll tax.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
It's the opposite of a stealth tax.
We'll see what this gives. Just final question, Oliver, on this. Looming over all this is, curiously, the legacy of Liz Truss, who fell foul of the bond markets where governments go to borrow. They didn't like what she was doing. And this now imposes a fiscal discipline on chancellors that never existed in the previous 10 years when interest rates were abnormally low.
Yeah. I mean, I think the fascinating thing, if you step back from this manifesto, is it is weirdly Trussian. A lot is being gambled on growth and supply-side reforms, which, of course, is what Liz Truss was planning to do. Now, her difficulty was that she put the tax cuts ahead of the growth plan and she didn't get any of it assessed, which is why it went so wrong. And Starmer is not making that mistake. The plans in Labour's manifesto are funded. But what he wants to do, the kind of growth he wants to see in the public service, is reliant on getting growth in the economy. And if he can't do that, then there isn't simply going to be the money to grow the public service in the way in which he wants to. And, he is no more likely to hit that than Liz Truss is. And I think that's something that, not quite enough people have appreciated yet, but I think that will come to the fore in the coming months and years.
Well, Oliver, you're the perfect guest because you sent me up perfectly for our next guest to talk about economic growth. Oliver Wright from The Times, thank you for joining us. Delighted now to welcome Liam Halligan, economist and columnist for the Daily Telegraph. Liam, welcome. Let's look at this issue of economic growth. Labour's always saying we'll get more growth, we'll have a higher growth rate, that will solve all sorts of problems. But when I look at what Labour proposes, I can see that some of the things over time would make a difference to economic growth if done properly. But there's no short-term solution to economic. They're not proposing anything that will result in higher growth very quickly.
No, there's no lever that you can pull that delivers economic growth. Of course, economic growth is the sum total of hundreds and thousands and millions and billions of transactions in the economy at any point in time. And I think there is a sense that there's something slightly Trussian about this Labour manifesto. If Labour had anyone in their midst that understood the party's own history, they'd be talking about Tony Crosland, of course, who wrote The Future of Socialism back in the 50s, a huge figure in the Labour Party in the 60s, famous education secretary, because he too tried to solve the central conundrum of government. We haven't got enough stuff to give away to our voters by saying, but if we grow the economy, the cake gets bigger. So it's Trussian, but it also has its roots in the philosophy of most of our mainstream parties.
Now, one of their central supply side reforms, and it's a subject you've written a lot about because it's about housing, that is that they plan to loosen up the planning laws, to force local councils to designate land for development and more house building and so on. And I understand the logic behind that. But how long does that take? Assuming they can do it, there will be resistance. How long does that take before it manifests itself in economic growth?
I think what Labour are trying to do is right. I'm amazed all the parties don't talk more about housing. It's kind of the everything problem. You got a long commute. It's because you can't buy a house in the right place. You got a massively stretched family because everyone's working full time because you've got an enormous mortgage. Knife crime because social housing. There's a huge shortage. Lots of people in temporary accommodation. A huge social housing waiting list. But it does take time. Look, every single recovery from recession in this country over the last 100 years has been associated, Andrew, with a big boom in house building, except the deep recession that followed the global financial crisis in 2008-9. There was no house building boom after that. The recession was weak, meagre, drawn out, and the economy hasn't really got out of second gear since the global financial crisis. I think we can all agree. So to build more houses is the right thing, but you're coming up, of course, against a lot of vested interests, particularly in Tory and Lib Dem seats, which is maybe why Labour's been braver on planning reform, or at least talking about planning reform, than the other two main parties. Specifically, they're talking about what's called a land value tax, which you're right, my book Home Truths dealt with in detail. But my version of the land value tax, which has been endorsed by many politicians, many think tanks, is that when the value of agricultural land goes up, because it gets planning permission, it can go up 200, 300 fold. You share that massive planning uplift with the local authority. They can then build the schools and hospitals, the bypasses. That means that local development may not be as unpopular as it currently is. Labour wants to take all of that planning gain and give it to the state. So landholders are completely stripped of that value. That would mean they have to rely on what are called CPOs, compulsory purchase orders, to get any land released. And that will end up in the courts, and it will go on for years and years and years. A lawyer's bonanza paid for by us.
And I guess the point all along is that even if you get these things right, it takes a while before it percolates through into extra renewed economic growth. Now, the other thing that Labour has been saying, of course, is that they're going to have green investment. They're going to head to net zero by 2030. No one else thinks they can make it by then, but Labour says that's what it's going to do. I put it to you, the problem there is that, first of all, they've cut way back on the amount they're going to invest. No longer 28 billion a year, nothing like maybe 25 billion over 5 years now. But also a lot of that investment is capital intensive, doesn't create many jobs,
That's right.
And therefore doesn't put money in people's pockets and doesn't, again, lead to economic growth. So I come back to my original point. I see the point of all these supply side reforms, but they don't give you economic growth this year and maybe not next year.
Yes, supply side reforms by their very nature take a long time to impact the economy. It's the opposite of fiscal policy, where you can raise money and spend it immediately, put it in people's pockets immediately. But of course, we know from history, if you do that too often, you end up, as we did in the mid-70s, when Labour went cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund. The UK literally needed a bailout. It was our economic Suez. My first memory, maybe I was too nerdy as a child. You're right, the green investment will take a long time. And I anyway think we are moving towards a situation where there is a slightly less gung-ho approach to net zero policies. It doesn't mean that ordinary people don't want...
All over Europe, there's a less gung-ho report.
Incredibly, the Greens got absolutely walloped among young people in Germany. Crikey. But this green investment does take a long time, it seems to me. And I do think that ordinary people, they want to leave a better world for their children and grandchildren, but the costs of net zero, putting all the subsidies to the renewable companies on people's fuel and energy bills, is deeply regressive, because poor households pay more for their fuel and energy.
Indeed,
so I do think we're going to see a bit of a slowdown. Of course, the environmentalists will say, scandal, shock, horror. But I think ordinary men and women, well-meaning families will think, we want to do this, but the cost of net zero has to be more evenly spread across society. So it's not white van man who has to pay so much in order to meet these targets.
And the final point I'd like to put to you, Liam, on the economic growth issue is that by pinning so much on it, you are hostage to events that are not under your control. That economic growth in Britain is always also determined by global factors. And I look at the Eurozone now, it's stagnating still, not much sign of growth coming, its biggest economy actually declining. And across the Atlantic, I see signs of a slowdown there as well. And that's our single biggest national export market. So if these two things are taking place too, that makes economic growth all the more elusive as well.
There aren't many of us in the media, Andrew, who follow politics very, very closely, but also follow economics, and particularly global economics. Obviously, you do. I try to in my own way. And despite being a sort of trained economic forecaster, most economic forecasts are just educated guesswork. The idea that we're arguing about, tax burdens in 2029 as a proportion of GDP in 2029, they're both massive numbers. We have no idea what either of them is going to be, and we're having arguments about percentage points of the division of the two of it. It's completely mad. That's not to say we don't do our statistics, we don't build models, of course we do, but it's very difficult to know how those models will turn out. And you're completely right. growth is elusive. Growth is also extremely volatile and unknowable. It depends as much on the price of oil as it does on, the basic rate of income tax
Over
in the
which
UK.
we have no control.
Over which of course, we have no control. And actually, as geopolitical risks rise, and I would say geopolitical risks are currently at a post-Cold War high at this point, the price of oil, the price of gas, getting hold of the rare earths on which this whole green revolution depends, getting hold of semiconductors, the production of which is dominated by countries who aren't always friendly to us. These are the big global whiz-bangs that will really determine the future economic direction of this country for all the hot air that we talk about the British general election.
Indeed. We'll end it there. Liam Halligan, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
being with me. And I hope, listeners, that as you listen to Oliver Wright there and Liam Halligan, that you're hearing the kind of discussion about what faces us in the context of the election, a kind of discussion that you may not be hearing anywhere else. Anyway, that's our pitch.